becoming increasingly difficult. So I think what we've been suggesting is that really the key decisions will have to wait until May when we have a much better sense of
so
what our
school districts shouldn't react to that. They shouldn't react to that statement.
Right, and the problem is that, for example, with issuing layoff notices, you have to issue notices by March 15th. So districts will have to, if you only issue a certain amount and it turns out it's worse, now you don't have the ability to issue more notices. So districts will probably be extra, will probably notice more than they might even need to in March 15th, just to make sure that if things get worse, there's some wiggle room for them.
But you are saying that even if this number that you differ with the governor's office, it is one that is subject to change, based on circumstances. So you're not asking anyone to accept it as an absolute.
We're not saying you should replace the governor's numbers with our numbers. I think we recognize that there's a lot of uncertainty going on right now, and so we'll just be given the differences. Though it's just important to keep in mind as we're building a budget.
Okay, well that's helpful because I think it was that's helpful.
Assemblymember Restande.
Would the governor support a change in the layoff notice? I mean, it's getting to the point of you might as well just give every teacher a layoff notice because it's way too far out to predict, and it doesn't have the useful. I don't see the useful effect of it.
We don't have a specific position on that particular sort of flexibility.
I know that's different.
Well, right, but like I said earlier, we are working with school officials and stakeholders to try to craft as much flexibility for folks to deal with trigger reductions to the extent that they're pulled. So I don't think that anything is necessarily off the table. That's not something though that I can specifically say yay or nay to at this point.
Sure. On the finance part of it, why the heavy trigger in education? Why the 90%? Why? And if you go to higher ed, it's 95, 96, 97, whatever. So why not distribute it equally across the budget?
So, and I think this is a situation where you have to consider it in sort of overall context. So the triggers, the incremental value of the triggers are $5.4 billion. To the extent that the tax measure is unsuccessful. But you have to also consider what sort of gap was closed at the governor's budget. In other words, there were $10.3 billion in solutions that were achieved in the governor's budget, and that was a mix of revenues, obviously, and expenditure reductions. At governor's budget, the value of solutions in Prop 98 is only $544 million of that $10.3 billion. So what we had to, so in closing the gap at governor's budget, we had a roughly $9.2 billion sort of structural shortfall. We closed that with a mix of new revenues and expenditure reductions. I think Edgar touched on some of those. We also, where I get to the $10.3 billion number is we also built in a $1.1 billion reserve. In order to square your gap of $10.3 billion, we proposed, as I said, a number of different expenditure reductions, as well as the new revenues, primarily, obviously, the governor's tax initiative revenues, as well as some additional special fund revenues. Within that mix of new revenues that are being proposed and actual expenditure reductions, on the expenditure reduction side, Prop 98 in the governor's budget only realizes $544 million in expenditure reductions.
Yeah, but I guess we're going back to the problem of the rebenching and everything, though.
Okay.
Right? So you're functionally taking out more realistically.
Now, you're talking about the rebenching under the contingent, so under the trigger proposal.
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. All right. And it's.
But there's Plan A and Plan B.
That's right.
Plan A, you're saying essentially.
So under Plan, right. So under Plan,
education's being protected
They are.
or held safe under Plan A, and because of this enormous shortfall, you're saying in Plan B it.
So I guess what you need to do is so in considering, because we've heard the statistics is 90% of the trigger reductions are falling on Proposition 98. You have to consider that 5.4 million trigger, to the extent that it's pulled, has to be considered in the context of the starting gap where we started. And if you do that, you will find that Proposition 98 actually takes less than a 40% reduction, takes somewhere closer to a 30% reduction when you consider the total magnitude of the gap that we would have to close if the tax measures fail. So if you look only at the increment of trigger reductions that would be proposed to the extent that the tax initiative fails, then yes, you can say that that $4.8 billion trigger reduction is 90% of those particular incremental reductions. But if you consider it over the whole span in terms of the gap that you're trying to close, it's really about 30%.
Why backload it then?
We, at governor's budget, it was the intent to obviously protect education as much as possible, in the wake of 5 years of fairly significant reductions. It's taken, some could argue, a disproportionate share of reductions over the course of the last 5 years. And so at governor's budget, we put a premium and a priority.
I agree with that, but it also do you factor in the upheaval effect of having such a drastic cut on the backside?
Well,
and as we talked about, they budget for it anyways.
And so specific to the trigger, and I think Edgar hit on this point as well. Let's also consider that half the trigger is simply sort of taking back a proposed funding increase that would have paid down some deferrals and provided a hold harmless adjustment. I'm not suggesting that any of these, potential mid-year triggers are easy to deal with. That, though, is not the same as, repealing or reducing program, at the same time. I mean, the GO bond debt shift will have an impact. There's no doubt about that. That does, in fact, crowd out $2.4 billion in other program expenditures, and folks will have to adjust to that. And that would be that. I mean, from our vantage point, simply taking back the deferral repayment that we're proposing just means that we continue this practice of deferring more cash. Right. And there are costs associated with that. The real cut, though, in our view, under the trigger reduction, is the shift of GO bond into the guarantee and the displacement of program expenditures that will create.
But do you agree with the premise that most school districts are going to assume the worst case scenario on the trigger on the front end?
I don't know if I can agree with that, because you hear anecdotal evidence out there. I mean, there may be districts that are planning for the worst. I mean, we haven't ourselves conducted any survey to.
Well, you probably should. I mean, or at least talk to the other departments or the superintendent, because we've had experience for a couple of years now of this, so it's not an unknown situation.
Right. And I mean, again, we realize that folks are going to be in a difficult position to the extent that triggers, have to be pulled. And that's why we're trying to work with school officials and stakeholders right now to try to develop a plan that, is as reasonable as possible given the severity of those cuts. I mean, we're not going to gloss over the fact that, we're talking about that is a major mid-year reduction that folks are going to have to deal with. And it's, it's not pleasant.
Well, and we need to get back on track and allow you to complete your presentation, Eric. But one does wonder, in the light of the awareness of what deferrals have done, the rationale behind the bond debt shift, which, if we're truly trying to reach more stability, that seems contradictory to me. So I'll let you respond to that when I ask you the wall of debt question as well.
That's fine.
Because it seems like we're trying to do one thing, and then you have something coming head on that seems to be at cross purposes with that. I just need that explained. Okay. But please, Eric.
So I have only one page left.
Sorry.
Sure. And so just this last page we had left was just we were asked to provide a comparison of some of the other education-related initiatives that are currently out for signature. So this is just for your, so you can compare and contrast a little. It's tricky to provide a clear comparison because all of them raise a little bit differently the revenue. They're all for different amounts of time, and they all distribute the money in slightly different ways. So, but we just thought this might be helpful for you in comparing the differences. The key thing I would note in the governor's initiative, so of these, the governor's initiative is the one on the far right, Schools and Local Public Safety Protection Act. In this proposal, the education funds would essentially just flow through the existing Prop 98 formulas. And that makes it different from the others who all specify a very specific percentage that will go to schools.
All right. Thank you very much, Edgar. Yes.
And these other initiatives, do they shorten the gap if more than one passed?
We haven't. You mean if multiple initiatives were?
Yeah, multiple initiatives. Just curious about your projected shortfall and whether or not multiple initiatives impact that or do not impact.
Well, we haven't actually done a run of that, but that is a good question. We're struggling to trying to figure out whether we should start doing runs of this because there are also issues. For example, if multiple of these initiatives increase taxes on higher income earners, so if both of them were to pass, Does one of them trump the other? Do both of the taxes get implemented? We're still not completely sure. So it's very tricky in figuring out if many of them were to pass, exactly what the effects would be. We're not even sure we know exactly how the revenue would be collected in some of these cases.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that we've, I would like the Department of Finance to really perhaps speak a little bit about, as we're looking at the initiatives. And I think it's important to say we're not, just as we're saying that we have to wait until May to understand some of the revenue issues, I don't think we're at the end of the initiative process either, that negotiations are continuing around what initiatives might ultimately end up on the ballot, and so those conversations are ongoing. I think it was important to at least put them out there, because the governor's initiative is such a critical part of the budget that we are considering. But I think we touched briefly, and I think it probably would be a good idea to touch again on the effects to education if the governor's initiative does not pass, and then if there's potential that nothing could pass. Can you just speak a little bit for explanation purposes about the negative impacts if the governor's initiative, and why it's important to reach a compromise, why it's important for us to be working together, I think, to protect education and to fund it as best we can?
I think I can probably really only speak to what effects may occur to the extent that the governor's tax initiative does not pass. So, and we've discussed it a little bit. I mean, to the extent that that tax initiative is unsuccessful for education, we're looking at a $4.8 billion trigger.
Well, and can I just say, one of the things I hope you'll highlight is the fact that it's multi-year. We're looking at. I mean, we sometimes get stuck in a one-year budget, but if it doesn't pass, that means next year it hasn't either.
Well, and to be even more specific, it's a $4.8 billion ongoing reduction. So yes, it absolutely portends effects into future years, no doubt about it.
I think that's very important.
No doubt about it, absolutely. So that $4.8 billion trigger reduction, to the extent that it's pulled, first and foremost, we go back to essentially deferring 21% of program payments for schools again. And so schools will be once again on the hook for financing internal borrowing, external borrowing, and other costs to keep themselves afloat until those payments materialize to them in the following year. So we were really hoping that we could start tackling some portion of that wall of debt to, free them of some of those cash flow concerns. But, to the extent that the initiative fails, they're once again going to be dealing with, cash flow issues. And it could create, problems for, a handful of districts at least that are sort of teetering, and bordering on insolvency. I mean, it has very real repercussions for them, to the extent that, we can't actually start paying down the deferrals. The $580 million roughly will have an impact in the sense that that's actual program reduction that folks are going to have to deal with. It's a funding reduction that they're going to have to deal with. The shift of GO bond into the guarantee, it's true that it in fact would displace $2.4 billion in other program expenditures under 98. So if you have, and I don't know if we've actually touched on it specifically, but the GO bond debt costs are like your basic aid apportionments per student that are required by the Constitution. So these are payments that have to be made. So in addition to satisfying your sort of basic per student funding under the Constitution, you have to pay for the cost of GO bond debt. That's not something that we can skip. And so that really leaves you, with where are you going to cut $2.4 billion out of the Prop 98 budget?
And can you just elaborate at this point on your choice to make that shift instead of suspending Prop 98 as part of the trigger? And just calling it what it is, which is a over $2 billion cut to education.
We were considering the effects to both education and outside of education in the budget to the extent that the tax initiative fails. What we look to do is with the shift of GO bond, I think what we view GO bond obviously as having a nexus to sort of the cost of education and the expense of education. I mean, just like providing for faculty and staff salaries and benefits like we do under Proposition 98. The cost of constructing buildings is something that has, a very strong nexus to the overall cost of educating students. And so we thought that there, was a nexus there. It did provide budget solution on the non-education side as well, because we were trying to plug a very big gap on that side. And so those are really the two dynamics that we were considering. I mean, suspension is theoretically always, an option. We felt it was a better approach to shift GO-bond debt costs, within the guarantee, because they do have at least some nexus to the cost of educating students. And that provides, like I said, the flip side benefit to relieving the non-98 general fund of $2.4 billion for those costs moving forward. There were considering it just beyond that, there are very few choices that you have left, in terms of where to achieve a reduction of that magnitude. So to the extent that you don't shift GO-bond debt into the guarantee and you try to hold education harmless from that $2.4 billion. So in other words, to the extent that you tried to craft a smaller trigger reduction for education, it just means, incredibly significant reductions in other areas of the budget, So,
but what about crafting in a way that doesn't destabilize Prop 98 from here into the future, and just acknowledges the fact that we're asking schools to cut more than $2 billion? You suspend Prop 98, right. You cut the $2 billion, you still, that's just.
Yeah,
it is what it is.
We acknowledge that there could be. Edgar, I think, pointed out.
And you get the maintenance. Do you get the deficit factor or maintenance factor?
Maintenance factor.
Yeah. The maintenance factor then at least is calculated, right, so that there would be some accounting to schools that we've done this to them.
Yeah. No, and we recognize that there may be some, volatility, as Edgar mentioned, with some of those costs as you move forward. To the extent that the governor's tax initiative fails, we may be looking at very, very, very tight budgets, moving forward. And so on an ongoing basis, we felt that it was appropriate to shift GO-bond debt costs into the guarantee. So.
I know. I do think, though, that when there is some benefit to trying to be as clear as possible with everyone, including the public, about the nature of the cuts that will happen without the initiative passing. I sometimes think that we don't do ourselves a great service by making it more confusing for the public to grasp, and it's a very complex issue. When we're talking about over $2 billion of real cuts, to education and what that means. So I just, I think we have to continue this discussion. Of course, we all know it requires a 2/3 vote to suspend Prop 98. And that's another dynamic that we have to, consider. But when we're looking at the trigger portion of this whole plan, I think it's something that we at least need to, within this committee setting, discuss and understand all of the various impacts, pro and con, to the bottom line of our schools and the real impacts to education. And so, like I said, I will be relying greatly upon the educational community to come and speak to us on those issues and what they feel. We've heard from the superintendent, of course, that he would never recommend the suspension of Prop 98, and I'm sure none of us would ever desire to see that happen. However, in the context of this worst-case scenario, I think we need to understand all the impacts, both positive and negative, or maybe negative and less negative, of what we're considering. Could you address the wall of debt as my final question? And we do have to wrap up fairly quickly here, but how did you decide what were the bricks in your wall of debt and what bricks were not in your wall of debt? And then my question then about the cross purposes of what we're talking about, structural fixes and really getting everything on a solid footing. And then we hear from the LAO that the proposal to put the bond, debt service in, we're causing volatility again. So tell me how we get a consistent, get on a consistent track of a stable footing around the issues of financing education.
Well, first with the wall of debt, I think what we tried to do, the discussion that we've had here today illustrates that people obviously can develop different definitions for what a cut is, what debt is, you name it. When we were sort of conceptualizing what the wall of debt is, we focused predominantly on one-time costs and outstanding obligations that we needed to pay off. And that's why in the area of education, you see us trying to pay off in a fairly aggressive manner, all of our settle-up, QEIA, other settlement debt, mandate debt, things that are known, things that we can quantify, and so we took the approach of trying to identify predominantly those one-time costs that we could retire and could retire within the span of 5 years, with the package of revenues that are being proposed over that same time period. It's true that it's not. The wall of debt, as we've defined it, is not necessarily all-encompassing in the sense that it does not address, repayment of deficit factor or of maintenance factor and other things. And so, from other vantage points, it's not an all-encompassing view of what debt, is. It was the best and most aggressive approach that we could have taken over that span of 5 years, I think, to pay down what we knew to be sort of one-time existing obligations that we owed schools. With respect to the, this geo bond debt issue and the potential instability that it creates, I think we'll be the first to point out that it's not a perfect solution. It's a solution, I think, out of necessity. We go back to the notion that, to the extent that the tax initiative fails, what that means in the future for budgets is likely not good news. It's likely going to be that, we're going to face very tight budgets, for the foreseeable future. We're starting to finally reduce the size of our structural deficits. Revenues may, in fact, improve, but, it's unclear about how significant they'll improve and how quickly they'll improve. So we believe that, for the foreseeable future, it's prudent to put geo bond debt costs into the guarantee. It's not perfect. As Edgar says, there may be some volatility year to year in some of those costs, and those do crowd out other costs within 98. But we thought it was the best proposal that we could craft at this point. So,
thank you. Mm-hmm. Closing comment, Assemblymember Sondé.
And just to preface it by saying, I think the governor has been relatively straightforward in what he's done in a lot of areas with the budget, but I do think there's more work to be done, as Chairwoman said, on clarifying these terms and how we're using them and what we're assigning, what definitions we assign to these terms. I think we can use a lot of clarity. I think it'll help everybody, our budget and the residents of California, understand what we're doing. But I do reject your statement that ongoing we're going to have this problem without passing an initiative. I don't think that's true. Revenues, as you just did mention, are up. Growth is occurring even in our state budget. And revenues are growing, so I don't think you can say it's an ongoing budget forever. And on the other side of it, hopefully we're doing something to bring those revenues in besides raising taxes. Hopefully we're growing the economy, and that will bring in more revenue into the state without raising taxes. And the gentleman next to you works for an organization that has identified billions of dollars in savings in other areas. It doesn't have to be just cut education. There are areas to save money if we take up the LAO and the state auditor on recommendations they have made that can save the state billions of dollars. That's not even necessarily cutting services. That's just reforming the way you're operating. And you're operating in different parts of the budget and taking out inefficient systems. So hopefully your office takes a closer look at those recommendations and doesn't instantly just go into cutting schools right out of the bat. Anyways, thank you for coming here.
Yeah. Let me just clarify one point. I didn't mean to suggest at all that failure of the tax initiative means that you're going to be facing deficits for every year into the future. All I was attempting to suggest is, to the extent that the tax initiative does fail, we're still not quite out of the woods yet in terms of, where revenues are shaping up relative to sort of our expenditure obligations. So there could be, at least a few more years of relatively tight budgets. I mean, that's all I was trying to suggest. I'm not suggesting that, 10 years out from now, failure of that tax initiative means that we don't have as much, a sufficient amount of money to cover all of our expenses. So.
Thank you. Assemblymember Swanson.
Well, thank you both for the presentation. And I would say that this is a very difficult problem for us to address. It has been over all the years, but that I've sat here. But I would tell you that I too would say that I think the governor has been extremely transparent about trying to deal with the systemic budget problem, and he's been proactive in offering solutions that involve the public and the legislature, and I think that that's very healthy for us, and hopefully it will lead to a solution. I only hope that as we debate these questions, that we do involve the broader legislative community, where we have policy discussions, not be afraid to submit them to policy committees so we can have a full debate on the questions. And I also hope that we will pay attention to the cumulative impact of the cuts that we've suffered over the last 5 years, in addition to considering the financial impact of each cut. So when you go down the road of cutting early child development and child care, there are consequences to that, and I think we can't shut our eyes to those consequences. And if we find that cuts like that are too costly in the long run, we shouldn't make them, and we should look for some other way to address these questions. I think that's what people expect us to do, to as we evaluate all these items, to dig down deep. I get a sense that that the Office of Finance and the governor understands that and is willing to engage the debate. And my hopes is that the best ideas will win. But I think it's absolutely necessary, Madam Chair, as we go forward, to look at procedures and how we approach this question that allows for a full airing of these questions. And I think then we will get to some of the best solutions possible for the state.
Thank you. We will have public comment, but in my final comments, I want to thank you very much for your presentations, and I was happy that we were able to have a fairly free-flowing discussion format. And I think that some things are beginning to come clear, hopefully, around priorities. We're certainly very much committed, as I'm sure the governor is, to increase success by our students. At the same time, I think we're making it very clear that we see early childhood education as absolutely critical to achieving that goal, and frankly, the most cost-effective way to achieve that goal. I think we've also had a very clear discussion on the fact that there's a commitment here to try to stabilize the financing of education, not only in how schools receive their money and making sure the money is reaching the students in the most efficient way possible, but also in dealing with the issue of obligation, money owed, debt, whatever you want to call it, underfunding, that we need, as we look at the budget, to have all of those numbers very clearly in front of us as part of the context, and have a strategy in place, however many years it's going to take, to say that we will address it. There is an opportunity there for us to make a commitment beyond a good intention to address that issue. And I think that's another priority that we're saying. It's great to say we want student success. It's great to say we love young children and want them to be well educated. But if we are at the same time hollowing out and destabilizing the very system and structure itself of public education, we are not going to achieve that end. And so I'm very grateful for the discussion we've been able to have. I think we're going to be adding some other components to that as we discuss the priorities by which the lens we're going to see our final decision through. I don't think there's any question that we've all heard very clearly that several of these issues need to be much more fully heard, and we'll deal with that next week in terms of hearing about weighted student formula, and then hoping that will also be heard within the policy committee as well. So thank you very much, and with that we'll we'll transition to public comment if there is any. Don't feel compelled, but if you want to say something, we're here to hear you. You can come next week and give your public comment then, too. Thank you very much. Yes.
We'll keep it brief. Katie Valenzuela here with Public Advocates. And I first want to apologize because we weren't able to get all the student and parent representatives here that we were able to have on the February 16th Senate overview hearing. But if they were here, they would tell you that they share your concerns with the overall adequacy of funding, but they also are really concerned about the accountability for how that funding is spent, because they see their districts not spending the money that they have well now, and they're worried that that will be exacerbated under the governor's proposal. So that said, I'm giving you a purple handout so it doesn't get lost in your stack of papers. That gives you more detail around our specific proposals, which really say that we're generally supportive of the governor's idea around equalizing and having these mechanisms in place to ensure more equity across the state. But as long as there are key changes made around how weighted student funding would work, and also how districts will be held accountable for how that funding is spent between the schools within their district. Thank you.
Madam Chairwoman and members, Brendan Tuig on behalf of Preschool California. Just because there was a lot of discussion today about the transitional kindergarten and also the early childhood education cuts, we just wanted to register our opposition to those proposals and look forward to having a more robust discussion in future hearings. Thank you.
Thank you. And that future hearing is actually next week.
We'll be here.
Members, my name is Leilani Aguinaldo-Yee with Los Angeles Unified School District. One of the pressing matters for us now, as has been alluded to, is the need for contingency language if the triggers are pulled. And it's very comforting to hear that for the Department of Finance and for LAO, they recognize that this is a priority at this time. For this week, our board is moving forward this Thursday to approve 11,000 pink slips because we are in the position of assuming that the triggers are in place. We look forward to continuing to work with the committee and with the governor's office to make sure that there are adequate backups to address the situation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I just have to comment on that as a teacher that, it's very, very unfortunate that where the buck is stopping is in the homes of our teachers. And they're taking that pink slip home, and it's real. It's real to their families. It's real to their financial situation, their demoralization at the fact that they've given their lives to teaching kids, and this is the thanks they're getting. I can't emphasize enough how unfortunate it is that we're in this situation where it is our teachers that are the ones that for the next few months are going to feel that their lives are very uncertain and that they're just not appreciated for the commitment they've made. And it's just so very unfortunate. And I just want to say that we understand that and we value the teachers that are in the classroom. They're going to finish this school year up not knowing what next year holds for them or if they have a job. And that's really something that we have to somehow communicate as well, that the stakes are so very high and the impacts are so very real today. These teachers are going to be feeling it in the next month, the next couple of weeks, actually.
Madam Chair, and other states are recognizing that and are recruiting our teachers. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we should be concerned about that.
Yes, we should. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn Kepke with McHugh Kepke and Associates on behalf of the California Council for Adult Education and California Adult Education Administrators Association. And we appreciate the challenges before us. And while we also appreciate the need for flexibility at the local level, in some situations we would argue that flexibility has actually hurt education, particularly for adults in adult education and adult schools. Many of these folks do not have another alternative for basic skills, English as a second language, citizenship classes, career tech, vocational ed. And so we look forward to the discussion next week relative to that and the weighted student formula, and just encourage that to be considered as we move forward. Thank you.
Good morning. Pamela Gibbs, representing the Los Angeles County Superintendent of Schools. In addition to all of the other cuts that we've addressed today, certain cuts we think are going to be extremely harmful, not only because they impact children, but they're cost-effective and superior programs, like the AVID program, for example. Making a cut to that program, and I know I've met with some of you and your staff about this, making a cut to that program would result in very little cost savings to the state. The program is operated on a regional basis by county offices, as are other programs. And to eliminate the infrastructure that exists will make it very difficult for districts themselves to afford or even have the interest in implementing the program if they don't have those systems in place to help them move forward with the program. That's a program that, as you know, 91% of the kids who participate in that program go on to college and are successful. Why would we even put that on the list? ROPs, when we're talking about career tech, why would we put those things on the list? So we ask, as you talk about priorities today, that you consider some of these things that we think would be a cost savings and some benefit in the future. Thank you.
Madam Chair and members, very briefly, Bron Shea Jones on behalf of K-12 schools. We appreciate the hearing, the administration, LAO's testimony. I understand you have some tough questions before you have to deal with. We appreciate the administration being open to some of our concerns, and specifically, we support their proposal to do away with the SB 740 regulations as they pertain to non-classroom schools, non-classroom-based charter schools. I know you'll have a hearing on that, but I just wanted to say that those regulations have a long time coming that they be repealed, so we support the administration's proposal there.
Good morning. I'm Arthur Singer. I represent Time for Kids, which is an advocacy organization that works in favor of mental health programs for children. And I saw in the documentation that was provided prior to the meeting that the Early Mental Health Initiative, a program that's called EMI, is proposed to be eliminated. And we have great concerns about that. EMI is a grant program that funds mental health services for young children, kindergarten to third grade. It is a highly effective program as documented by independent research. It appears that the plan is to disperse the $15 million in some sort of this weighted student formula, and I'm not bright enough to attempt to understand what that means yet, but it appears that that may mean something like $2 a student, and there's no way that a program can be run on $2 a student. I appreciate hearing some of the committee members speak about the value of early childhood education, and you know the value of kids learning to read by by grade 3, and when children have mental health issues, that prevents them from gaining access to the curriculum and benefiting from education. The other aspect is the plan to institute the flex funding model would be to put the locus of responsibility at the local level. The grants that are provided through EMI are clearly locally based in that each school needs to make that commitment to participate. If a school does not see that the mental health needs of their young children are an issue, then they do not participate. But the grants provide, on a 50% matching basis, at least adequate funds to begin to serve children in a highly effective manner. So I would appreciate your consideration with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. My name is Shirley Arroyo. I'm the only counselor for kindergarten through third grade children in the Elk Grove Unified School District, the largest district in Sacramento County. And I want to put a human face on the Early Mental Health Initiative for many, many vulnerable children that are kindergarten through third grade. We are the only chance they're going to have for mental health intervention. We're extremely cost effective. For $15 million, we serve 30,000 kids a year. At school is the only place that their needs for social and emotional development and help are ever going to be met. At school, that's where we can help them. That's where we have access to them. And if their social and emotional developmental needs are met by these caring people that we connect them with and the relationships that are built, then they're able to learn. They're vulnerable, and we can equip them and help them become strong enough to be able to learn. And that's what we do, and we appreciate your consideration to save the Early Mental Health Initiative.
Madam Chair, members, Steve Henderson with the California School Employees Association, also representing the Education Coalition. We provided a letter of our concerns to the committee, but just briefly, we are definitely concerned and really appreciate the conversation that's happened here in committee regarding the administration's proposals. Because of the magnitude of the proposals, we agree that they should be addressed in policy committee so that the committee and the legislature can understand the outcomes to those populations that may not be served if, in fact, we go to something like a weighted student formula proposal. The other thing that I'd like to just mention to the committee is we are also have serious concerns about what happens if the initiatives do not pass and education is then required to pay $2.4 billion in debt service and the impact that's going to have with respect to pushing out other programs to make room for that debt service. We know you're going to have more hearings on these specific issues in the future, and we look forward to working with you.
Madam Chair, Bill Lucia with Ed Voice. There are handouts coming out here, and I just want to make a few quick points. Averages are deceiving. That came out already today when you were looking at the per pupil revenue limit numbers. When you get to the issue of definitions and terms, remember that every single time averages are deceiving, and there are distributional effects. The Plan A is already being messed with because of dynamics over the last 6 weeks since or more than that now, since the governor's budget was introduced. Your colleagues in other budget subcommittees have already changed Plan A, and it looks like the tendency will continue if this committee doesn't exercise more leadership in allowing all your colleagues to use this committee as an ATM machine. And there's one thing in the schematic and the handouts that you haven't had directly addressed in all the definitional terms, and that goes back to the issue of deferrals and the fact that we agree with the administration and the need to pay those down, and why there's not a schematic on the issue of statutory constitutional is because we believe the governor's doing the right thing because we believe they're unconstitutional. We even believe further that just the plain English reading of the Constitution when the deferrals are supposed to be, when money on an accrual basis is supposed to be paid. Further, though, after the hard work of this committee a year ago, working on deferrals, and now that thanks to the department and their hard work, we can get a 77-page Excel spreadsheet that I and my staff are poring over. We've come across what we believe are unconstitutional consequences of deferrals from a Serrano standpoint. There are school districts in the Bay Area. I won't go naming names, but we are going to make this public, and it's not going to be happy information. There are large school districts in the Bay Area that have less than $50 per kid being deferred. There are other large school districts in Southern California that are getting deferred $1,000 a kid. There's African American and high levels of poverty, African American and Latino districts where the deferral amount per kid is $1,400. It's way outside the revenue limit bands of Serrano. In terms of looking at what school districts face in the trade-offs, look at this is public information off of the department's website. Imagine you're talking about teachers and think of what school leaders and CFOs are faced with. Imagine with those monthly payments, it's not, we talk about an average of 17% or maybe 21%. Just getting Plan A adopted doesn't mean that we go back to an era of not having to pay back, have this borrowing and cash management problem. It's a serious problem. If you're trying to plan your family budget, how would you like to have 87% of the money deferred that you just got in February and say you're not going to get that until July, or in March not getting it paid till August? Turning the page, there's not a single other program in government that has a constitutional guarantee where people are ignoring the $18 billion with no IOU. There's not another budget subcommittee in this legislature that's had an $18 billion reduction, where the money's being paid from a subsequent year's guarantee in the Constitution. That's not happening anywhere else in state government. This deferral schedule, let's not lose sight of the fact. In the LAO handout, they talked about $2.4 billion. Make a little line at $2.4 billion and then draw another 7.6 below that. That's the size of the problem for deferrals that cannot be swept under the rug. This schedule from the Department of Ed, I've highlighted it for you. It says ongoing, 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 ongoing. Those are billions and billions and billions of dollars ongoing. Mm-hmm. This budget doesn't address anything but the $2.4 billion. That's a good start. It's what revenue. There's lots of pressure, but the $10.3 billion problem that grows to $15 billion if the voters vote no, that's serious. But what about if the LAO's number is right? That means the $15 billion problem goes to a $21 billion problem. There are consequences for kids and teachers with what's going on with the deferrals. And finally, I'll leave you with the last note. And this is, we believe, is accurate. We're thankful that the superintendent has this on their website because we believe this is honesty. That if you read this, the state has implemented several kindergarten through K-12 apportionment deferrals to address the state's ongoing cash shortage by moving payments within a fiscal year in tri-year deferrals, or to lower the level of K-12 program funding in the current year by paying some of the current year program in the subsequent fiscal year. It's not constitutional. It's not okay. There are distributional effects that are outside of the Serrano bands, and there are ways in a thoughtful manner to still address these issues, even if there are challenges ahead. But to realize that kids are affected, and the teachers and the pink slips are affected when CFOs are planning Plan A or Plan B. There are big consequences when you only look at the averages and you think you can button it up and you're done. But when it goes down to the school district level, it is not equal, even when you're looking at the same types of kids. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question on this?
Yes.
On the first page on this handout, I'm not sure that I understand it, because if you add up all the deferral amounts that you have here, it doesn't add up to the number that we've been talking about.
These are K-12. This is just the K-12 portion of the cross-year deferrals that we believe are unconstitutional. There are other deferrals that are intra-year deferrals, that it's taking money from within a fiscal year. One payment is just being delayed to within the fiscal year, and we believe on an accrual basis, the Constitution is accruing defines a certain amount of revenues that are general purpose for purposes of calculating guarantee and what are owed to schools. And on an accrual basis within a year, that's a policy judgment that the legislature can make, right, to defer money within the year, months of payments. But absent a suspension of 98 or some other constitutional language, we've created a fiction. If deferrals are okay, if deferrals are constitutional, then with a $9 billion problem, why not just add $9 billion to deferrals and we can all call it a day? It's all done. If this budget subcommittee is an ATM machine for the rest of government, then just let's defer another $9 billion and it's all done. It's not okay. And it's happening regularly now.
Thank you.
My name is Allison Collier. I'm a representative from Center Unified School District. While I appreciate the comments that have made from some of my colleagues about the Early Mental Health Initiative, there are a couple of items that I would like to add. I appreciate the comments from this committee today where there's clearly some thought going into how different actions affect other programs and other aspects of education. Right now, with the budget deductions across the state, we are seeing larger and larger class sizes in K through 3. That increases the likelihood that our more fragile K through 3 students are going to have difficult time adjusting to the school environment. Early Mental Health Initiative directly addresses that. And so to make those funds flexible in a way that does not really significantly improve the funding for educational districts is not a good choice. In addition, the longevity studies of that program have proven that the impacts of the Early Mental Health Initiative, very low cost, are also sustained over time, and actually we see an increase in the child's ability to adjust to the school environment. So we are also looking at cost savings in the long run of more serious and more costly mental health costs. This is a cost-saving measure that, if eliminated, does not help districts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one more.
Last. Estelle Lemieux with the California Teachers Association. I want to thank the committee for its very thoughtful deliberation today. CTA is also reviewing very closely the rebenchings that are occurring. Our attorneys, our constitutional attorneys, are also, doing the reviewing for us. So we appreciate having this thoughtful discussion. We have some concerns about the weighted student formula, some serious concerns. We mentioned here today that for 1 year we're being held harmless, so we have to think down the road as well. We appreciate that the governor is stepping up to the plate and taking care of the $544 million cut that would have if the tax initiative passes, would have been cut for home-to-school transportation. However, the governor does propose to eliminate home-to-school transportation in out years, and we would oppose having home-to-school transportation eliminated. We have to get our kids to school. So with that, we look forward to working with everyone. A little bit on the trigger. Of course, as you know, we represent the teachers, and we have some very, very big concerns about all the pink slips going out March 15th. Any delays in giving districts certainty in terms of Plan A and Plan B is not good, and the sooner the better that the legislature can come up with legislation that could give a direction to districts and more certainty to our folks would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Do you know at this point in time, statewide, LAUSD just testified 11,000 pink slips. Do you have any idea what the aggregate is at this point in time? Or
we're just starting to get those numbers from our staff, but we're looking between probably 20 to 30,000 because districts are looking at the worst, scenario as they have to. But we see districts having to do two budgets this year, Plan A and Plan B. Plan A, and hopefully that the governor's tax initiative will pass. CTA does support that initiative. And Plan B for the worst, ugliest possible scenario. So,
and are you looking at this data on the best case and worst case? Because I'm assuming, or I would hypothesize, that there's still going to be pink slips in the best case scenario.
I think there will be, yes. I imagine that there will be layoffs, period. That's just, especially with the governor's tax initiative, if it goes down. So, and hopefully we have a prevention of cuts next year, because really, frankly, that's what the governor's tax initiative does for the next year. Gives us flat funding and sets us up for hopefully the next, good 4 years after that. So that's.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll adjourn the meeting.